Have you ever wondered what happens when a person closes a door so tightly that they forget how to open it again, only for someone to arrive with the perfect key? This is a story about the heavy weight of a lost future, the quiet precision of rebuilding a life piece by piece, and the unexpected courage it takes to let something matter once more. It is a tale of grief, craftsmanship, and the profound realization that sometimes the foundation we thought was destroyed is simply waiting for a new frame. If you enjoy this type of content, please do not forget to subscribe to our channel, Wildwood Hearts. We post videos every day, so be sure to leave a like if you enjoy this story, and drop a comment below letting us know where you are from and what time you are listening to us. Part 1, Colorado, 1885. There are certain men who have the ability to close a door so quietly and deliberately that nobody in the vicinity even notices it closing. Thomas Vance was exactly that kind of man. He was 30 years old and unequivocally the best carpenter residing in Pine Valley, and perhaps even in the whole of the Colorado Basin. Everyone in the town and the surrounding areas who needed something sturdy and reliable, built inevitably came to him. He was the one responsible for the barns that withstood the harsh winters, the bridges that spanned the rushing creeks, the wide porches attached to the local homesteads, and even the schoolhouse roof that had been giving the town continuous trouble. Since before anyone in the valley could clearly remember, Thomas Vance showed up exactly when he was needed, carrying his tools with a quiet determination. He executed his work with the absolute precision of someone who deeply believed that how you build a physical object inherently reflects who you are as a human being, and then he simply packed his equipment and went home when the task was finally completed. His joints were always perfectly flushed, his measurements were never off by even a fraction of an inch, and his dedication to the structural integrity of every project was unmatched in the county. People did not hire him for lively conversation or friendly banter. They hired him because a structure built by Thomas Vance was a structure that would essentially outlast the people who commissioned it. He approached every single piece of timber with a practiced eye, assessing the grain and the weight before his plane ever touched the surface, ensuring that the foundation of his work was entirely true. He was highly respected by everyone in Pine Valley, yet he was truly known by almost no one. 5 years ago, however, he had been a completely different man, a much younger and lighter version of himself, who laughed easily, made expansive plans for the days ahead, and had a clear future with a definitive shape to it. Her name was Amelia Stanton. Amelia Stanton was 20 years old, possessing light brown hair and a sudden, bright laugh that always arrived without any warning. She had a specific way of looking directly at him that made Thomas feel like the absolute best version of himself was the one who was standing right beside her. They had grown up in the same town and had been, for so long, simply the other person's person that neither of them could remember a time before their connection existed. She was the beloved daughter of the local mill owner, while he was just the humble carpenter's apprentice. Nevertheless, the match was considered entirely inevitable by everyone in Pine Valley who knew them. They had spent countless hours talking meticulously about the house they would build. This was what Thomas remembered the most clearly in the long, quiet years after. It was not the grand, dramatic moments, but rather the small, quiet ones. He remembered the Tuesday evenings sitting on the porch of her father's house, when they had talked at length about exactly what he would construct for their shared life. They planned for 2 bedrooms to start, a south-facing kitchen specifically positioned to capture the morning light, and a porch wide enough to comfortably fit 2 chairs, and offer a long, uninterrupted view of the valley. Amelia had also distinctly wanted a garden. Not a practical garden, she had specified once with the firm precision of someone who had thought about this deeply. She wanted not vegetables, but flowers, things that did not have any practical use except for simply being beautiful. Thomas had promised her that he would build whatever she wanted. He had meant it completely and without reservation. They were scheduled to be married in the bright spring of 1880. However, the severe fever arrived in February. The illness moved rapidly through Pine Valley, the way those harsh fevers often moved, incredibly fast, highly indiscriminate, and completely without interest in the lives or the futures it was violently interrupting. Amelia got sick on a Tuesday morning, starting with a severe headache first, which was rapidly followed by a terrible radiating heat that simply would not break. By Thursday, her condition had deteriorated so much that she could not even leave her bed. Thomas pulled a heavy wooden chair directly beside her mattress and firmly refused to leave it. By Sunday, she was completely gone. She was only 20 years old. Thomas sat perfectly still beside her motionless body for a very long time after she passed. The room was incredibly quiet. The bitter cold of the Colorado winter raged. Outside the frosted windows, he looked intently at her pale face, at the familiar face he had been adoringly looking at since he was 16 years old, and he understood, with the crushing finality of something terrible that arrives all at once, that the beautiful future he had been carefully building toward in his mind had just instantaneously become a past. Thomas eventually stood up, walked slowly back to his own home, and did not come out of his house for 4 entire days. When he finally emerged from his isolation, he simply went straight back to his tools and his work. During that bitter winter before the fever had arrived, Thomas had meticulously built Amelia a beautiful hope chest. It was constructed from hand-joined, premium oak, with the corners fitted tightly together using the absolute precision he put into absolutely everything he created. It was heavily reinforced and built to last 100 years. That hope chest was still sitting silently in the corner of his solitary cabin, entirely covered with a heavy protective cloth. He had not lifted the lid or even opened it since the devastating week that she died. Instead, he had just kept moving forward. He had kept building practical things for other people. He had gotten remarkably good at being highly useful to the town and very deliberate and intentional about being entirely alone. He built a massive, sturdy barn for the Miller family that following spring, ensuring that every single joint was precise. Every individual board was perfectly level, and the whole massive structure was incredibly solid and undeniably true. He built that immense barn the exact way a broken man builds something substantial, when he literally has nowhere else in the world to put the massive emotional weight he is heavily carrying inside him. He finished building it, went straight home, looked silently at the covered hope chest resting in the dark corner, thought deeply about a planned garden of flowers with absolutely no practical use, and lay awake in his bed until the dark Colorado sky slowly transitioned from pitch black to pale gray, and finally to the bright gold of yet another new day that Amelia was not living in. 5 years is a very long time to actively grieve, but a very short time to truly stop. Thomas Vance had decidedly not stopped grieving. He had merely learned how to carry the massive weight of it differently. He carried it exactly the way a physical laborer carries something exceptionally heavy, not by finally putting the burden down on the ground, but by carefully adjusting how his hands and shoulders hold it, so he can manage to just keep moving his feet forward. He was exceptionally good at his carpentry work. He had, of course, always been good at it, but in the long, hollow years after Amelia's death, he had transformed into something much more profound. He became the kind of master craftsman who implicitly understood that the structures you built would far outlast you, and who intentionally put that deep, sobering understanding into every single joint, nail, and heavy wooden beam he touched. People eventually started traveling from 3 separate counties just to have the opportunity to hire him. He lived quietly in a small, self-built cabin situated on the absolute edge of Pine Valley. There was absolutely nothing remarkable about the dwelling from the outside, but inside, it was clearly the meticulous work of someone who fundamentally knew exactly what exceptionally well-made things looked like. Every single shelf was perfectly level. Every interior door was hung completely true on its hinges. The heavy kitchen table was solid enough to withstand a century of heavy daily use. The hope chest was still resting silently in the corner of his bedroom. He had deliberately draped a thick cloth over it during the 2nd year of his mourning, supposedly not to forget what was underneath it, but merely to keep the accumulating dust off the flawless oak surface. He was honestly not sure if there was actually a difference between those two motives. He strictly did not attend any local social gatherings or town events. He was not an unkind person by any means. He was consistently very generous with his personal time and his exceptional professional skill, but there was a distinct, heavily guarded quality to his quiet presence that the townspeople inherently recognized and politely respected. He operated much like a sturdy wooden door that was propped wide open for strict professional business, but securely locked and closed off for absolutely everything else. The residents of Pine Valley had eventually completely stopped trying to aggressively introduce him to new prospective women. Sarah Jenkins, the observant woman who ran the town's busy general store, had known Thomas since long before Amelia was even in the picture. Sarah had carefully witnessed both the joyous before and the tragic after of Thomas Vance's life, and she made it her personal mission to quietly tell the nosy townspeople that Thomas was a fundamentally good man who had unfortunately had something vital violently taken from him, something that a person simply does not ever replace. Sarah always stated this assessment with the flat, practical accuracy of a serious person, merely reporting a geographic fact. When she said this, the listening people slowly nodded in silent agreement. From that point on, they solely hired him for his exceptional labor and largely left him completely alone to live in his structured solitude. For a very long time, this strict arrangement seemed like it was enough. Thomas had firmly told himself every single day for 5 long years that his quiet, undisturbed existence was enough. He was, however, not entirely sure if he actually, truly believed his own internal reassurance. But contemplating any other alternative lifestyle strictly required him to actively consider opening an emotional door that he had very deliberately and with great effort permanently closed and bolted shut. And some heavily fortified doors, once a person deeply understands exactly what closing them originally cost their soul, feel absolutely impossible to ever pry open again. As a master builder, Thomas had successfully constructed enough physical objects to clearly understand the mechanical principle that any joint actively held together by sheer, rigid fear, rather than by a proper natural fit, would eventually crack and fail. Despite knowing this mechanical truth, he had not yet actively examined whether that exact same logical principle directly applied to the heavy, invisible doors of the human heart, as well as it did to blocks of solid oak. This perfectly balanced, isolated reality remained entirely uninterrupted until Evelyn Hayes arrived in Pine Valley. Evelyn arrived in town on a crisp Wednesday morning in late September, bringing with her 2 large, heavy travel trunks, a mechanical sewing machine, and an incredibly specific, detailed plan. Her carefully constructed business plan was highly specific. She fully intended to open a dedicated seamstress shop in the currently empty, dusty storefront located directly next to Sarah Jenkins's general store. She planned to quickly establish herself firmly in the community before the harsh winter weather set in, and aggressively build a loyal clientele by the time spring arrived. She was only 19 years old, but she possessed the particular, unstoppable energy of a young woman who has definitively decided exactly what she is going to achieve with her life, and absolutely refuses to be argued out of it by anyone. She had already been completing complex clothing alterations and handling difficult custom sewing commissions since she was only 14 years old, having learned the intricate trade from both her mother and her grandmother. Now, at 19, she was entirely certain that the growing town of Pine Valley was the exact right place for her business, and that this current moment was the exact right time to launch it. Evelyn possessed a striking head of auburn hair, marking her as someone who effortlessly turned heads without even actively trying to do so, and she carried herself with the sharp, unyielding directness of an independent woman who had long since decided that other people's opinions of her were simply not her personal problem. She set about sweeping out the old storefront and organizing her supplies with an impressive, methodical focus that caught the attention of many locals passing by the large front window. Evelyn had been living in the town for exactly 3 busy days when she first realized that she required the professional services of Thomas Vance. A large, heavy wooden shelf bracket had suddenly come completely away from the plaster wall in her new shop. It had been very poorly installed by the previous careless tenants, and she absolutely needed it to be properly and securely fixed before she could safely stack her heavy, expensive bolts of colorful fabric upon the shelves. When she asked around for help, Sarah Jenkins immediately directed her, telling her confidently to go and ask Thomas. Evelyn promptly walked out to the edge of town and easily found him working diligently inside his large, organized workshop. He was standing silently at his heavy wooden bench, carefully and methodically working a thick piece of solid oak down into a smooth door panel. When she approached, he briefly stopped his tool and looked up at her, wearing the very specific blank expression he universally reserved for unfamiliar people. It was an expression that was incredibly polite, but strictly, professionally present, lacking any personal warmth. "Miss," he simply said to her, nodding his head slightly. "Evelyn Hayes," she confidently replied, matching his directness. I've just opened the new seamstress shop located directly next to the general store. I have a loose wooden shelf bracket in there that desperately needs some professional attention. Thomas stood completely still and looked at her carefully for a long moment, processing her sudden appearance in his quiet space. She did not look away. She stared right back at him with bright, direct green eyes. Eyes that had clearly been looking directly and fearlessly at the world since she was young enough to form her own firm opinions. He felt something incredibly faint shift inside him, something buried deep that had been completely silent for 5 years, but he quickly forced it down. "I can come by your shop on Thursday," he finally said, his voice flat and steady. "Thursday works perfectly," she replied without hesitation. Before leaving his property, Evelyn took a slow, deliberate moment to look thoroughly around his expansive workshop. She carefully observed the various sharp tools impeccably arranged in strict size order on the back wall, and she noted the exceptionally clean, uncluttered surface of his heavy wooden workbench. "You built this entire shop yourself?" she asked him directly. "Yes," Thomas said, keeping his answer as short as possible. "It is very well made," she stated flatly. She did not say it as a bubbly compliment, but merely as a factual observation completely devoid of any unnecessary social decoration. Thomas looked down at his workbench, feeling slightly unsettled by her piercing, practical observation. "Thursday," he repeated again, re-establishing the strict, professional boundary between them. Evelyn simply nodded her head once and promptly left the building. After she was entirely gone from his property, Thomas stood alone in the silence and looked blankly at the rough piece of oak resting on his bench for a very long time. Eventually, he slowly picked his heavy iron plane back up and forced himself to go back to his solitary work. He aggressively commanded himself not to think about how closely she had observed his workshop or how she had looked at his surroundings with the specific, rare attention of someone who genuinely understood exactly what impeccably well-made things looked like. He firmly decided that he was not going to think about this minor interaction at all. Consequently, he ended up thinking deeply about it for the absolute rest of the entire afternoon, his mind replaying the exact shade of her green eyes and the confident cadence of her voice as the wood shavings piled up around his heavy boots. When Thursday arrived, fixing the damaged shelf bracket only took Thomas exactly 20 minutes of actual labor. Evelyn already had a hot pot of fresh coffee ready for him when he stepped through the door, and she stood quietly nearby, watching him diligently work with the deep, quiet attention of a person who generally paid very close attention to how the physical world functioned. He efficiently repaired and secured the broken bracket, and then, completely out of habit, he took it upon himself to carefully check the structural integrity of all the other existing shelves while he was already standing there. He quickly discovered 2 additional brackets that desperately needed immediate reinforcement, and he silently fixed those weak points as well, without ever being explicitly asked to do so. When he stepped down from his stool, Evelyn looked closely at the newly secured shelves. "You fixed the other ones as well?" she asked, noting the fresh screws. "They needed it," Thomas said bluntly. "They would have eventually come down under the heavy weight of your fabric." When it was time to settle the bill, she deliberately paid him slightly less than what the high-quality work was actually worth, thanked him politely for his prompt time, and he immediately left the premises to return to his isolation. However, the very following Tuesday, Evelyn unexpectedly appeared at his remote workshop once again. She calmly explained that the heavy front door on her new shop wouldn't latch properly against the frame. She asked if he could possibly come and look at it whenever he had some spare time. He begrudgingly walked over to the shop on Wednesday. Fixing the faulty door latch only took him 10 brief minutes of labor. He carefully adjusted the small metal strike plate, rigorously tested the swinging mechanism, and subsequently discovered that the heavy wooden door frame itself was actually resting slightly out of plumb. It was not nearly enough of a structural deviation to cause any immediate, catastrophic problems for her business, but it was certainly enough to guarantee future issues down the line. Being the meticulous craftsman he was, he automatically fixed that underlying issue as well. Then came the following week, when she reported a stiff window frame that absolutely wouldn't close completely tight against the wind. Shortly after that, it was a random floorboard near the counter that creaked far too loudly, and then a specific wooden shelf hidden in the dark back storage room. Thomas reliably showed up and professionally fixed every single one of them. Soon, he began to acutely notice that the specific physical issues requiring his professional attention were spaced out at incredibly consistent intervals. It was precisely one minor task per week, and it was always something relatively small, always a minor inconvenience that could have theoretically waited months to be addressed. He noticed this distinct pattern with the sharp precision of a seasoned man who had been building and repairing complex things for 15 long years. A man who could easily tell the glaring difference between a genuine structural problem that desperately needed immediate attention and a minor issue that had been deliberately saved up, just as an excuse. He did not verbally say a single thing to her about this obvious realization. He simply kept coming to the shop exactly when she asked him to, efficiently fixed whatever small thing needed fixing, drank the hot coffee that was always waiting for him, and slowly found himself engaging in the quiet conversations that accompanied the physical work. They talked smoothly about the ongoing developments in the town, about the growing success of her seamstress shop, about the various books she was currently reading, and, surprisingly, about the specific, golden quality of the fading Colorado autumn light, a deeply specific topic which she held very strong, detailed opinions about. Thomas realized with a start that he had never in his entire life talked about the intricate details of the Colorado autumn light with absolutely anyone else before. Every single time he finished his work and walked back to his quiet cabin, he went inside, stared at the covered hope chest silently sitting in the corner, and sternly thought to himself, "This is absolutely not what it looks like." Immediately following that thought, he would firmly tell himself, "I absolutely need to stop going over there every time she asks for help." But invariably, a few moments later, his practical mind would defensively counter with, "The large window frame located on the east side of her shop is definitely going to give her severe trouble by the time February arrives, if it isn't properly reinforced soon." It should be clearly noted that on that particular Thursday evening, Thomas did not dare examine the highly contradictory order of those specific internal thoughts too closely. Thank you so much for listening to the story so far. What do you think is going to happen next? Do you believe he will finally open that door he closed so long ago? Or will the weight of his past keep him firmly anchored in his solitude? Please let us know your thoughts and predictions down in the comments below. And if you are enjoying this journey, please remember to subscribe to our channel, Wildwood Hearts. We post new, deeply moving videos every single day, so leaving a like and a comment really helps our channel grow and allows us to keep bringing these beautiful narratives directly to you. Now let us dive right back into the story. For the first 2 years following the devastating tragedy that took Amelia Stanton from him, Thomas Vance had been aggressively haunted by vivid, incredibly detailed dreams of her almost every single night. Visions that left him waking in cold sweats with a violently racing heart. These relentless nocturnal visions were rarely ever about the sudden, terrifying onset of the fever, nor did they focus on the agonizing, quiet final days they had spent together in that suffocating room. Instead, his deeply treacherous subconscious exclusively tormented him with the beautiful before. His mind continuously replayed the warm, golden Tuesday evenings they had spent sitting contentedly together on the wide front porch of her father's house, the endless, detailed conversations they shared regarding the specific layout of the future house they were actively planning, and the sudden, bright sound of the way she effortlessly laughed at his quiet jokes. During those early, agonizing years of fresh grief, Thomas had routinely woken up from those beautiful, lifelike dreams feeling the absolute, crushing weight of a desperate man who has just been forcefully returned against his will from somewhere infinitely warm and perfectly good, dragged violently back into a cold, empty reality he absolutely did not want to inhabit. Gradually, as the heavy, monotonous months slowly bled into long, silent years, the intense frequency of those heartbreaking dreams had mercifully begun to lessen, becoming a rare occurrence rather than a nightly torment. He had actively gone out of his way not to think about Amelia's face in the dark, and for 2 solid years, he had successfully managed to completely suppress any nighttime visitations from her memory. However, on a particularly cold Thursday night in late October, exactly the very same Thursday night directly following the afternoon he had diligently reinforced the failing east window frame at Evelyn Hayes' seamstress shop, Amelia Stanton unexpectedly returned to him in a profound, incredibly vivid dream. She did not return in the frantic, highly anxious, and deeply unresolved manner in which profound grief typically forces lost loved ones to violently reappear in our fractured subconscious minds. Instead, she arrived in his mind exactly the way she had always existed in life, incredibly easily, radiating a natural warmth, with that familiar infectious laugh hiding just visibly behind her bright, expressive eyes. In the dream, she was sitting calmly and contentedly on the wide, sweeping front porch of the exact beautiful house they had meticulously planned out together, but had never actually managed to physically build in reality. She looked absolutely perfect, appearing exactly as she had when she was 20 years old, completely untouched by the ravages of the terrible fever or the cruel passage of time, bringing a profound sense of peace that completely enveloped his sleeping mind. "Thomas," she said softly in the dream, her voice carrying the exact same crystal-clear resonance he had desperately missed for half a decade. "Amelia," he replied, his dream self feeling a sudden intense swelling of emotion that he had spent the last 5 years actively burying under mountains of physical labor and isolating silence. She was looking very closely at him with that specific, highly recognizable expression she always wore when she was about to gently but firmly tell him something important, something that he stubbornly did not want to acknowledge, but absolutely needed to hear for his own good. "You are being incredibly careful with yourself," she observed quietly, her tone lacking any judgment but filled to the brim with profound, knowing empathy. "I am always very careful," Thomas defensively replied, retreating instantly into his familiar, rigid identity as the town's most meticulous, unwavering craftsman. "With your wood, yes," she quickly agreed, nodding her head slightly. "But with yourself? You are being excessively careful in the exact same frantic way you behave when you are utterly terrified that something you are building is fundamentally structurally unsound and simply won't hold together under pressure." Thomas looked away from her piercing gaze, shifting his attention out over the long imaginary porch, glancing toward the beautifully designed south-facing kitchen they had conceptualized, and staring out at the wide, expansive view of the Colorado Valley that stretched out infinitely before them. "She looks directly at you, Thomas," Amelia finally said, her voice dropping to a softer, more intimate register that commanded his absolute attention. "She looks at you in the exact same way that I used to look at you." Thomas remained completely silent, his jaw clenched tight in the dream, utterly unable to formulate a coherent response to this undeniable truth. "Thomas," she pressed gently, her voice remaining exactly the way it had always been in life, incredibly direct, deeply warm, and completely devoid of any unnecessary pretense or artificiality. "The beautiful garden we talked about, the one filled entirely with bright flowers that serve absolutely no practical use whatsoever. I always, truly wanted you to eventually have that in your life. What exactly do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice cracking under the intense emotional weight of her words. She smiled warmly at him then, that specific, radiant smile that had always arrived completely without warning and instantly managed to change the entire atmosphere of the room. "Not just physical flowers exactly," she explained patiently. "I mean having something in your life that serves absolutely no practical, utilitarian purpose. Having something solely and exclusively just because it is wonderfully good, and just because it is simply beautiful." After a long, pregnant pause, she continued, "You have spent the last 5 years of your life endlessly building strong, enduring things solely for other people to enjoy. It is time you finally build something meaningful for yourself." "I honestly don't know how to do that anymore," Thomas confessed, his voice heavy with defeated resignation. "Yes, you absolutely do," Amelia countered with absolute, unwavering certainty. "You have always implicitly known exactly how to build beautiful things. You just completely stopped believing that you were actually allowed to." Thomas woke up abruptly at exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, finding himself heavily surrounded by the pitch-black, suffocating darkness of the deep Colorado night. He lay perfectly still in his solitary bed for several long minutes, his chest heaving as he slowly processed the profound, lingering echoes of the incredibly vivid dream. Eventually, his eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, and his gaze was magnetically drawn to the heavy, solid oak hope chest still resting silently in the far corner of his bedroom, completely shrouded by the thick, dusty cloth he had draped over it years ago. He lay there, and stared intently at the obscured shape of the chest for a very long time, his mind racing with conflicting emotions and long-suppressed desires. Finally, unable to remain in bed any longer, he slowly got up, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders against the creeping chill, walked over to the cast-iron stove, put the heavy metal kettle on to boil, and then sat down quietly at his incredibly solid, self-built kitchen table. Sitting there in the quiet solitude, illuminated only by the faint flickering glow of a single oil lantern, he actively and deeply thought about a vibrant, thriving garden completely overflowing with beautiful, colorful flowers that possessed absolutely no practical use or utilitarian purpose whatsoever. And then, for the absolute first time, in 5 incredibly long, painful years, the sudden thought of that beautiful, useless garden did not instantly fill him with a crushing, agonizing sense of loss and paralyzing pain. Instead, the thought gently washed over him, feeling like something entirely different, something he had entirely forgotten the texture of. It deeply and profoundly felt like genuine permission, a quiet, undeniable authorization from the past, finally allowing him to step forward into the future. When the crisp, colorful month of October finally arrived in full force, it officially brought with it the highly anticipated annual Pine Valley Harvest Fair. This massive, town-wide event was exactly the kind of vibrant, energetic rural gathering that small, tight-knit western towns have been passionately organizing and hosting since long before anyone currently living in the valley could actually remember. It was a bustling, chaotic intersection of local commerce, deep-rooted community bonding, and the sheer, undeniable collective energy of hard-working people who had successfully survived yet another grueling, exhausting agricultural season, and had actively decided to aggressively celebrate their ongoing survival. The large, sprawling fairgrounds were entirely packed with wooden display booths, fierce agricultural competitions, lively instrumental music echoing through the brisk autumn air, and vastly more rich homemade food than was strictly necessary for the town's population. Evelyn Hayes had proudly secured a prominent booth for her new business right near the center of the festivities. She had spent the previous 2 entire weeks meticulously preparing her intricate display, staying up late into the night working tirelessly by lamplight. She proudly showcased numerous high-quality samples of her finest sewing work, elegantly draping the colorful fabrics and delicate lace over a beautifully constructed small wooden display rack that Thomas Vance had quietly built for her the previous Tuesday. He had absolutely not built it because she had explicitly asked him to do so. Rather, he had built it solely because he had silently observed her visibly struggling with her makeshift display arrangements while he was passing by her shop, and he had simply arrived the very next morning carrying the perfectly finished, impeccably joined wooden rack. When he had silently handed it to her, she had looked closely at the flawless craftsmanship of the rack, and then looked directly at his face, choosing to say absolutely nothing at all, a heavy, profound silence which inherently functioned as its own specific kind of deeply meaningful sentence between them. Her bustling booth quickly proved to be incredibly popular at the fair. She had only been living in the growing town of Pine Valley for a mere 6 weeks, yet she had already successfully built an impressively large and fiercely loyal clientele. This rapid success was partly because she was genuinely, exceptionally talented at her intricate sewing work, but it was also largely because she was Evelyn, and the local people were naturally and effortlessly drawn to her vibrant, magnetic presence in the exact same way that freezing people are instinctively drawn to a roaring, warm fire. Thomas had only originally come to the crowded fairgrounds that day, strictly to help the organizers with the heavy wooden livestock pens, which desperately required extensive structural repair and critical reinforcement before the massive, anxious animals arrived for the judging competitions. It was an entirely practical work-related reason for him to be present amidst the overwhelming social chaos he usually avoided. Working with his usual intense, focused efficiency, he completely finished repairing the heavy wooden pens shortly before noon. By all of his strict, self-imposed rules of isolation, he absolutely should have immediately packed up his heavy tools, turned his back on the festivities, and walked straight back home to the quiet safety of his empty cabin. Instead, he found himself hesitating, standing quietly at the very far edge of the bustling fairground, when his eyes suddenly caught sight of a scene that made his chest violently tighten. He clearly saw Evelyn standing brightly in her booth, entirely surrounded by 4 very eager, incredibly persistent young local men, who were aggressively competing against one another for her undivided attention, all of them armed with the foolish, unyielding determination of arrogant youth. She was, of course, expertly handling the overwhelming situation exactly the way she handled absolutely everything else in her life. She was incredibly warm, deeply direct, and remained completely, effortlessly in control of the entire shifting dynamic. One of the young men aggressively told a joke, and she briefly threw her head back and laughed at something he said. When Thomas heard that specific sound, a local man standing nearby casually remarked to a friend, "Now that right there is the real laugh." Thomas stood, entirely still, looking down blankly at his rough, calloused hands, feeling a sudden intense surge of an emotion he could barely contain. Without making a conscious decision, he slowly began walking directly toward her crowded booth. He genuinely did not know exactly why he was doing it. He simply found himself standing right there in front of her, before his logical mind had even officially decided to authorize the terrifying movement. Despite the chaotic, swirling crowd of people in the 4 eager young men violently vying for her attention, Evelyn's sharp green eyes instantly found Thomas the exact second he approached the perimeter of her booth. He stopped a few feet away and looked intensely at her. He then briefly shifted his gaze to look critically at the posturing young men, and then he looked directly back at her face. In that specific, highly charged moment, he suddenly felt something massive moving deep inside his chest, an incredibly powerful, overwhelming emotion that he vaguely recognized from his distant past, but had absolutely not genuinely felt in 5 incredibly long, agonizing years, and had fiercely sworn to himself that he would never, ever allow himself to expect to feel again. Slowly, he offered her a faint, guarded smile, the specific, tight half-smile he instinctively utilized whenever he was experiencing something incredibly profound, but had absolutely no intention of ever actually vocalizing it. "You are definitely going to break a whole lot of hearts around here," Thomas said to her, his deep voice cutting cleanly through the surrounding noise of the fair. He strictly meant the sentence to function merely as a casual, objective observation, a safe, conversational way of vocalizing something aloud that wasn't the actual terrifying thing his mind was currently screaming at him. Evelyn stopped what she was doing and looked directly at him, her expression shifting into something incredibly serious. The 4 loud young men were, technically, still standing right there beside her, but she was now looking exclusively and entirely at Thomas, as if the rest of the world had completely ceased to exist. She remained perfectly quiet for a very long, agonizing moment, possessing the specific, profound quietness of a deeply intelligent person who is meticulously choosing her exact words with extreme care. Then, very slowly, she offered him a smile. It was absolutely not the loud, bright laugh she had given the boys. It was the other smile, the much quieter, infinitely more intimate one that carried the heavy weight of absolute sincerity. "I only ever wanted to mend yours," she said softly, her green eyes locked intensely onto his, stripping away all of his carefully constructed defenses in a single devastating sentence. And then, without waiting for his stunned reaction, she smoothly turned around, walked back to the center of her booth, and calmly resumed helping an older woman examine a delicate piece of white lace. Thomas stood absolutely frozen at the dusty edge of the busy fairground, physically surrounded by the 4 bewildered young men who were also just standing there, utterly confused by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. All of them were silently thinking about the exact same beautiful woman, yet only Thomas fully understood the massive, life-altering weight of what she had just actually said. He stood rigidly in that exact spot for a very long time, his mind violently reeling as the loud music and laughter of the fair washed over him completely unnoticed. Finally, unable to process the sheer magnitude of his internal panic in public, he abruptly turned around and rapidly walked straight back to his isolated cabin. He did not sleep for a single second that entire night. He went directly into his dark house after fleeing the fair and sat rigidly at his heavy wooden kitchen table for hours on end, staring blankly into the suffocating darkness. The heavy oak hope chest was still, sitting silently in the corner of the room, exactly where it had been for half a decade. He had not lifted the lid to look inside it in 5 grueling years. He looked at it intensely now, staring at the thick layer of dust on the heavy cloth, staring at the solid, unyielding shape hidden underneath, staring at the beautiful physical object he had meticulously built for a bright, hopeful future that had violently and permanently failed to happen. His exhausted mind violently spun as he deeply thought about exactly what Evelyn had said to him at the fair. "I only wanted to mend yours." He relentlessly thought about the massive, agonizing emotional cost it would heavily require him to actually let that sentence mean what it obviously meant. He deeply analyzed the absolute devastation that occurs when you finally allow something to truly matter to your soul, only to have the cruel universe violently rip it away from you again. He had already paid that horrific, unimaginable cost once in his life. He knew exactly, with terrifying physical precision, what that specific type of world-ending devastation felt like. And the deep knowing of that pain was not merely a distant, fading memory. It was a highly active, incredibly heavy physical thing residing permanently in his chest. A massive burden he had carefully learned to walk around every single day but had never actually been able to put down. He thought desperately about Amelia, about the vivid dream, about her ethereal voice, telling him, "You just completely stopped believing you were allowed." He thought intensely about Evelyn standing boldly at the fair, her piercing green eyes effortlessly finding him hidden in the dense crowd. He aggressively rationalized to himself, "I am a master builder. I know exactly what a perfectly sound, structurally flawless foundation looks like, and I know exactly what this is." And then, overcome by sheer, unadulterated terror, he aggressively thought, "And that is exactly why I absolutely cannot do this. I cannot survive another collapse." He remained seated motionlessly at the sturdy kitchen table for 3 agonizingly long hours, paralyzed by the warring factions of hope and terror violently clashing inside his mind. Finally, unable to bear the heavy tension any longer, he abruptly stood up and began, with quiet, systematic, and entirely ruthless efficiency, to pack his few personal belongings. Several months ago, back in August, he had been formally offered a highly lucrative long-term construction job out in the sprawling city of Denver. It was a massive commission to oversee the structural framing of a grand new luxury hotel, a complex project that would guarantee him vastly more money than he could possibly earn in 2 full years of working in Pine Valley. At the time, he had politely but firmly turned the massive offer down, solely because he had absolutely no desire to leave the quiet, predictable safety of his established isolation. But now, fueled by sheer panic, he firmly decided he would write his formal letter of acceptance tonight. He fiercely resolved that he would be entirely gone from this valley before the bitter winter snows even began to properly fall. He aggressively convinced himself that he absolutely must leave because Evelyn Hayes was a vibrant, brilliant 19-year-old woman who fundamentally deserved a whole, undamaged man. Someone who could easily give her absolutely everything she wanted without severely burdening her. With the massive, suffocating weight of the profound doubt and trauma he was constantly carrying, he determined that he had to leave immediately, because actively staying in Pine Valley directly required him to fully open an emotional door that he was entirely, absolutely certain he would not mentally survive having to close again if tragedy struck twice. He packed his heavy canvas bags carefully, meticulously, and methodically, executing the grim task the exact precise way he did absolutely everything else in his highly structured life. He decisively left the heavy oak hope chest sitting untouched in the corner of the room. He then sat down rigidly at his small writing desk, dipped his pen into the dark ink, and forcefully started drafting the formal letter of acceptance directed to the wealthy businessman in Denver. He quickly wrote 3 sharp, decisive sentences. Then, his hand suddenly froze, and he abruptly stopped writing. He slowly looked over his shoulder at the covered hope chest. He deeply thought about the vivid dream once more, hearing Amelia's clear, resonant voice echoing through his fractured mind. "You have always known exactly how to build things. You just completely stopped believing you were actually allowed to." With a violently trembling hand, he slowly put the metal pen down on the wooden desk. He stared at the flickering lantern light for several minutes. Finally, driven by overwhelming fear, he stubbornly picked the pen right back up. He rapidly finished writing the rest of the cold, professional letter, folded it sharply, and sealed it tightly with wax. He placed it squarely in the dead center of the desk, ready to be sent out on the very first morning stagecoach. Then, completely exhausted, he finally went to bed, lay perfectly stiff in the suffocating darkness, listened intensely to the howling Colorado wind rattling the glass panes, and aggressively lied to himself, repeating over and over again that he was undeniably doing the right thing. He desperately repeated the hollow phrase so many times that by the time dawn arrived, it almost actually felt true. It deeply felt like the right thing to do, in the exact same treacherous way that violently closing a heavy door always technically feels like the right thing to do, right up until the exact devastating moment you finally realize you are permanently standing on the wrong side of it. Thomas Vance permanently left the town of Pine Valley on a cold, gray Tuesday morning, riding out on his horse long before the vast majority of the town's residents were even awake. He deliberately told absolutely no one about his sudden, drastic departure, with the sole exception of Sarah Jenkins. He was strictly forced to stop by the general store to settle his final accounts and pay for his necessary travel supplies. Sarah stood behind the heavy wooden counter and looked intensely at him with the deeply frustrating, highly disappointed expression of a wise older woman who has been quietly watching a complex, beautiful situation slowly develop, only to find the sudden, cowardly resolution entirely inadequate and utterly pathetic. Denver, she stated flatly, reading the destination on his heavy supply bags. It is for work, Thomas quickly replied, defensively avoiding her piercing gaze. Sarah merely grunted, a heavy, judgmental sound that aggressively communicated her absolute, unfiltered disdain for his transparent excuse. Evelyn only found out about his shocking departure on Wednesday morning, when she cheerfully walked over to his large workshop to ask a question, only to find the heavy doors firmly padlocked and the building completely empty and silent. Utterly confused, she rapidly walked back to the general store and anxiously asked Sarah what had happened. Sarah calmly and bluntly told her the harsh truth of his sudden abandonment. Evelyn did not scream, she did not cry out, and she absolutely did not tell anyone else in the town what she was currently feeling inside her chest. Instead, she immediately went straight back into her shop, sat down rigidly at her cluttered work table, and aggressively began working on a complex dress alteration that desperately needed finishing, being incredibly, almost violently precise and methodical about every single individual stitch she pushed through the tough fabric. The very next day, on Thursday, she forced herself to walk slowly back out to the abandoned workshop, entirely because Sarah Jenkins possessed a spare metal key to the building, and Sarah strongly insisted that Evelyn absolutely needed to go inside and see something important. Evelyn unlocked the heavy door and stepped into the quiet, dusty space. Resting completely alone on the absolute center of the large wooden workbench, positioned with Thomas's signature, flawless geometric precision, sat a beautiful, small wooden box. The corners of the delicate box were meticulously joined together with a level of master craftsmanship that bordered on the impossible. When she slowly opened the tight lid, she found an incredibly detailed, beautifully carved wooden flower resting inside. It was exactly a flower with absolutely no practical use whatsoever, an object whose sole purpose in existence was just to be overwhelmingly beautiful. There was absolutely no explanatory note left anywhere in the box or on the bench. Evelyn stood alone in the cold silence and held the flawlessly carved wooden flower gently in her hands for a very long time. The empty workshop strongly smelled of fresh oak and sharp sawdust, the exact, specific, comforting smell she had been actively finding clever excuses to be near for the past 6 weeks. She slowly turned the delicate wooden flower over and over in her trembling hands. He had clearly carved it with incredible, painstaking care, giving it the exact same intense, laser-focused attention he gave to absolutely everything he built, ensuring that every single individual petal was utterly perfect and precise. Yet despite this massive display of intense care, he had still cowardly left it entirely without a single written word of explanation, and he had literally fled the town to hide in Denver. She genuinely did not know if this beautiful object was intended to be a final, permanent goodbye, or if it was actually the clumsy, terrifying beginning of something massive that he simply did not yet possess the emotional vocabulary to know how to properly finish. She carefully placed the wooden flower deep inside the pocket of her dress, physically pressing it against her side. She then turned around, walked out of the empty shop, locked the heavy door behind her, and stoically went straight back to her sewing work. She was only 19 years old, and she had just bravely said the absolute truest, most vulnerable thing she had ever said to another human being in her entire life. And the man she loved had cowardly abandoned her anyway, leaving her to realize that the agonizing torment of simply not knowing the truth was significantly harder to endure than the actual leaving itself. The sprawling, noisy city of Denver was vastly larger, significantly louder, and infinitely more chaotic than the quiet, predictable streets of Pine Valley. The massive hotel commission he had accepted was incredibly real. The physical labor required was intensely demanding, and Thomas violently threw his entire physical being into the grueling work with the manic, desperate focus of a broken man who absolutely needs to not think about one very specific painful thing. He forced himself to work brutal, 12-hour shifts every single day, exhausting his muscles until they screamed. Under his relentless driving supervision, the massive skeleton of the luxury hotel rapidly began to take shape against the city skyline, emerging as an incredibly solid, exceptionally well-made structure, where absolutely every single joint and heavy beam was measured and secured with flawless precision. Outwardly, to the other rough builders on the site, he appeared completely fine. Inwardly, he was absolutely, undeniably not fine. Exactly 2 weeks into his self-imposed exile, Thomas woke up violently at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, finding himself completely engulfed by the unfamiliar, suffocating darkness of his cheap Denver boarding house room. He lay frozen in the highly uncomfortable, unfamiliar bed, listening to the loud, distant sounds of the city, and he relentlessly thought about a beautiful, meticulously carved wooden flower that he had cowardly left behind entirely without an explanatory note. He obsessively wondered whether Evelyn had actually found it sitting on the bench, and what she must have possibly thought of his pathetic, silent retreat. He thought deeply about the heavy, solid oak hope chest he had shamefully left sitting covered in dust back in his quiet cabin. He aggressively thought about the vivid, life-altering dream of Amelia. Her haunting words violently echoed in the dark room. You just completely stopped believing you were actually allowed. He thought intensely about exactly what it fundamentally meant that he had spent hours meticulously carving that delicate flower, creating a beautiful object completely devoid of any practical use. Exactly the specific type of beautiful thing that Amelia had always desperately wanted him to allow himself to have. And yet he had still shamefully left it behind. Without a single brave word of context, he deeply realized that he had acted exactly like a terrified man who had walked right up to the edge of finally saying something incredibly important, only to entirely lose his nerve at the absolute last possible second and sprint frantically away in sheer terror. Suddenly, completely unable to lie to himself anymore, Thomas violently sat straight up in the pitch-black Denver darkness. He deeply and critically thought about absolutely everything he had ever built in his entire life. He considered every single massive barn, every sturdy wooden bridge, and every flawless interior cabinet. He had flawlessly built absolutely all of it exclusively for the benefit of other people, entirely because he had fundamentally and completely stopped believing that he was ever actually allowed to actively build a beautiful life for himself. He thought about Evelyn sitting quietly at her cluttered work table, behaving with incredible, stoic precision, actively, refusing to ever perform her deep internal feelings for anyone else's entertainment. And then, with a crushing wave of profound shame, he deeply thought about exactly what kind of pathetic, cowardly man intentionally leaves behind a beautiful flower and a deafening silence, and then dares to call that failure enough. He immediately forced himself out of the uncomfortable bed, his heart pounding violently in his chest as he fumbled in the cold darkness to find a match and light the small oil lantern resting on the worn bedside table. He sat down heavily at the small wobbly desk in the corner of the bleak room and quickly pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, aggressively writing a formal letter directly to the wealthy hotel owner who had hired him for the massive project. In the letter, he carefully and honestly explained that a highly urgent personal matter strictly required his immediate return to the town of Pine Valley, deeply apologizing for the sudden inconvenience and assuring the man that he would promptly send a glowing recommendation for another highly skilled master carpenter who could easily take over the complex framing work. He wrote the letter carefully and honestly, refusing to make up any elaborate excuses or dramatic lies to soften the blow of his sudden departure, fully accepting the professional consequences of his abrupt decision. As soon as the ink was dry, he folded the letter, sealed it, and methodically began packing his heavy canvas bags, tossing his clothes and few personal belongings inside with a frantic, desperate energy he had not felt in years. He paid for the room in full, leaving the money securely under the inkwell, and walked out into the freezing gray Denver morning to quickly saddle his horse before the sun had even properly breached the distant horizon. As he pulled the heavy leather straps tight and secured his bags, he felt an overwhelming sense of urgency completely wash over him, a desperate need to cover the long distance between himself and the colossal mistake he had cowardly made back in that quiet workshop. He firmly swung himself up into the saddle, pointed his horse out of the chaotic city limits, and began the long, grueling ride back toward the mountains, his mind solely focused on the daunting task of somehow undoing the massive damage his fear had caused. He rode incredibly hard for 2 entire days, pushing himself and his horse to their absolute physical limits as they navigated the rugged, winding trails that led back deep into the familiar valley. For every single agonizing mile of that grueling journey, his exhausted mind was entirely consumed by deeply analyzing exactly what he was going to say to her when he finally arrived, desperately trying to construct a coherent apology out of the shattered fragments of his broken courage. He thought endlessly about Amelia, deeply reflecting on the profound concept of permission, and actively contemplating the beautiful, necessary existence of vibrant flowers that possessed absolutely no practical use whatsoever. He thought intensely about a brilliant, brave young woman who had fearlessly looked him directly in the eyes, said the absolute truest, most vulnerable thing she had ever said to another human being, and fundamentally deserved vastly more than a cowardly carved wooden flower left alone in a deafening, echoing silence. He urged his tired horse to run even faster, as the vast, sweeping Colorado Valley slowly opened, up ahead of him, revealing the towering snow-capped mountains, the massive endless blue sky, and the deeply specific, golden quality of light resting gently on the tall autumn grass, the exact specific light that Evelyn held such strong, detailed opinions about. He suddenly felt something incredibly profound physically shift inside his chest. It was the exact same overwhelming, expansive feeling of pure, unadulterated hope that he vividly remembered feeling when he was 25 years old, happily riding his horse toward a bright, beautiful life he was actively building with someone he completely loved. He had absolutely not felt that specific, soaring sensation since the devastating week the fever had ripped his world apart. Yet here it was, undeniably present and violently demanding his full attention. He did not try to bury the terrifying feeling this time. Instead, he leaned forward in the saddle and actively rode directly toward it, letting the cold wind rush past his face as the familiar buildings of Pine Valley finally appeared on the horizon. He finally arrived back in the familiar, quiet streets of Pine Valley on a crisp Thursday afternoon, his clothes heavily covered in trail dust, and his body aching from the relentless, punishing ride. He rode slowly and deliberately straight down the main street, actively ignoring the deeply surprised, lingering stares of the townspeople, who had firmly believed he was gone forever, and he securely tied his exhausted horse to the wooden post directly outside the busy general store. He pushed the heavy wooden door open, the bell jingling loudly above his head, and stepped inside to find Sarah Jenkins standing firmly behind the long counter, actively sorting through a new shipment of winter supplies. Sarah immediately stopped what she was doing, slowly looked up from her inventory list, and stared at him silently for a very long, highly judgmental moment, her sharp eyes taking in his exhausted, dusty appearance and the frantic, desperate energy radiating from his posture. "You actually came back?" she finally said, her voice completely flat and giving absolutely nothing away regarding her internal feelings on the matter. "Yes," Thomas simply replied, his voice raspy from the long journey and the heavy weight of the moment. Sarah let out a sharp, decisive grunt. She said, but this time, the specific sound inherently meant something entirely different from the disappointed noise she had made weeks ago. It was much closer to a deeply satisfied, highly relieved declaration of, "It is about time you finally came to your senses." She is currently working right next door at her shop, Sarah stated quickly, volunteering the crucial information before he could even gather the courage to ask her where Evelyn was. He simply nodded his head once in deep gratitude, turned around, and walked slowly out of the general store, his heart hammering violently against his ribs as he approached the familiar, painted storefront of the seamstress shop. He reached out with a trembling hand, grabbed the solid brass handle, and slowly pushed the door open, noting with a distant sense of professional pride that the heavy metal latch he had meticulously fixed back in October was still working flawlessly. The small brass bell securely mounted above the door rang out sharply, breaking the quiet, focused silence that heavily blanketed the interior of the warm, brightly lit shop. Evelyn was sitting rigidly at her cluttered work table with her back completely turned to the door, diligently working on a complex piece of heavy fabric with the incredibly focused, unyielding precision of someone who has been very deliberate and highly intentional about aggressively staying focused on their work to avoid breaking down. "Just a moment, please," she called out politely without turning around, her voice incredibly steady and completely professional, assuming it was simply another local customer coming in for a winter fitting. Then she suddenly heard the heavy silence radiating from the doorway, the incredibly specific, highly charged quality of a heavy silence that is fundamentally and entirely different from the usual, casual silence of a waiting customer, and she slowly turned her chair around. She looked directly at him. He was standing completely frozen in the doorway, awkwardly holding his dusty hat in his rough, calloused hands, wearing the heavy, visible exhaustion of 3 weeks of relentless running and intense, agonizing overthinking clearly written across his face. The beautiful golden Colorado afternoon light poured perfectly through the specific window frames he had carefully repaired, illuminating the massive gulf of unspoken words violently swirling between them. Neither of them said absolutely anything for a very long, seemingly endless moment, the silence stretching out until it felt like the very air in the room was physically vibrating with tension. Then, she slowly stood up from her chair, absolutely not performing a false sense of composure, but rather acting genuinely, actually composed, possessing the profound stillness of someone who has spent the last 3 agonizing weeks actively deciding exactly how she would feel if this exact impossible scenario ever actually happened, and has finally arrived at a concrete, unyielding answer. "Thomas," she said quietly, her voice betraying absolutely no anger, just a deep, resonant acknowledgement of his sudden presence. "I left you a carved wooden flower," Thomas suddenly blurted out, the raw words clumsily escaping his throat, which was absolutely not the carefully constructed, eloquent apology he had meticulously planned to deliver first during his long ride back. "I found it," she replied simply, her bright green eyes remaining locked intensely on his face, waiting patiently for him to finally explain himself. "I absolutely should have left a note with it," he continued, his voice trembling, slightly under the crushing weight of his profound regret. "I really should have." He abruptly stopped speaking, took a deep, shuddering breath, and forcefully started again, forcing himself to strip away every single layer of defense he had built over the last 5 years. "I completely left because I was absolutely terrified. I was not afraid of you. I was terrified of what it fundamentally meant, terrified of exactly what happens when you finally let something truly matter to your soul and then the cruel universe violently rips it away from you." He looked down at his dusty hat for a brief second before forcing his eyes back up to meet hers. "I violently lost someone I completely loved 5 long years ago. Her name was Amelia, and I loved her deeply, and she tragically died from the fever, and I survived it by building a massive, heavy door around my heart, and I permanently closed it, and I aggressively told myself every single day that staying isolated was undeniably the right thing to do to survive." "I already know," Evelyn said incredibly quietly, her voice soft but carrying a massive emotional weight. "Sarah told me some of the tragic details after you left. The rest of it, I easily figured out entirely on my own by looking at the silence you left behind. I meticulously carved you that flower," Thomas said, taking a slow step forward into the room, "because it is a flower with absolutely no practical use whatsoever, something just beautiful. And I cowardly left, without writing a note because I got completely overwhelmed by sheer panic at the absolute last possible moment, and I pathetically ran away to hide." He looked up at her, his eyes burning with an intense, desperate sincerity. "I am absolutely not afraid anymore. Or maybe I still am deeply afraid, but I am entirely done letting that fear make my decisions for me." Evelyn slowly crossed the wooden floor of the shop, moving with the deliberate, unyielding certainty of a strong woman who has definitively made a massive life decision and is now completely, fearlessly living inside of it. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of the lavender she used to press her fabrics. "I am absolutely not trying to erase her, and I am not trying to replace her in your heart," she said, her voice remaining incredibly steady, and her bright eyes shining with unshed tears. "I am absolutely not trying to make you ever forget her. She was a real, beautiful person, and she truly mattered, and she always, always will matter." Her voice was incredibly firm, possessing a profound emotional maturity that completely defied her young age. "I just want to be here, standing right beside you, if you will finally let me." Thomas looked down at this incredible, brave 19-year-old woman standing fearlessly in front of him, staring deeply into the absolute truth shining clearly in her green eyes, and he physically felt something massive inside of him, something that had been heavily locked and permanently closed for a very long, agonizing time, finally, violently break open. It did not open all the way, and it certainly did not open all at once, but it was undeniably, permanently open. He slowly reached out his trembling hand and gently took her soft hand in his. She looked down at his calloused hand, tightly holding hers, observing the stark contrast, and then she slowly looked back up at his face, and she began to cry quietly, completely, and without any hesitation. She cried exactly the way a person cries when something deeply profound that they had completely given up all hope on miraculously turns out to still be beautifully, undeniably true. He held her hand tightly in the warm silence of the shop and said absolutely nothing else, entirely because there was absolutely nothing he could possibly say that was actually better than the incredible reality of what was already actively happening between them. The following Sunday afternoon, under a clear, bright autumn sky, he carefully took her by the hand and walked her out to his quiet cabin, specifically to show her the heavy oak hope chest. He had absolutely not opened the heavy wooden lid in 5 long, agonizing years. He had deliberately covered it with a thick cloth and had actively lived his entire daily life, carefully maneuvering around it, existing in the exact same cautious, avoidant way a person lives around a massive, dangerous object they are absolutely not, yet emotionally ready to directly face. Evelyn sat quietly beside him on the hard wooden floorboards of the cabin, directly in front of the imposing chest, offering her silent, steadying presence. Thomas took a deep breath, reached out, and slowly lifted the dusty cloth, casting it aside. The chest sitting before them was exactly what it was always intended to be, a beautiful, flawlessly constructed hope chest, built with immense love and care by a highly skilled young man for the specific woman he was planning to happily marry. The wooden joints were still incredibly tight, the polished surface was perfectly smooth, and it was undeniably built strong enough to last a century. With trembling fingers, he finally grabbed the heavy lid and slowly opened it. Resting inside the cedar-scented darkness was a beautiful hand-stitched quilt that Amelia's mother had lovingly started making specifically for their upcoming wedding. Beside the quilt was a small, worn Bible with Amelia's full name, delicately written on the inside cover in her own elegant handwriting, and a beautifully pressed wildflower, now incredibly dry, brittle, and fragile, that she had personally placed inside the chest during the crisp autumn just before she tragically died. And resting quietly at the very absolute bottom of the chest was a small, carefully folded piece of aged paper, completely covered in Amelia's familiar, flowing handwriting. He had never, in all his years of grieving, been able to summon the profound courage required to actually open and read it. His rough hands were strictly not entirely steady as he reached down to retrieve it. Seeing his intense struggle, Evelyn gently reached out and placed her warm hand directly over his trembling fingers, silently grounding him in the present moment. Supported by Evelyn's steadying touch, he slowly unfolded the fragile piece of paper. It was a detailed, meticulously written list, a specific, deeply personal list of all the various beautiful, things she desperately wanted for the new house they had happily planned to build together. She had carefully written down the necessity of the south-facing kitchen to catch the morning light, the wide front porch for sitting in the evening, and there, right at the absolute bottom of the paper, firmly underlined twice for heavy emphasis, she had written, "A beautiful garden, absolutely not practical, no vegetables, just bright flowers, just beautiful things." Thomas stared intently at the fading ink on the list for a very long, quiet time, a single tear escaping his eye and rolling slowly down his weathered cheek. Then, he carefully and gently folded the delicate paper back along its original creases and held it tightly in his palm. Evelyn remained sitting quietly beside him on the cold cabin floor, saying absolutely nothing, entirely because she deeply understood that she absolutely did not need to fill the profound, sacred silence with unnecessary words. After a long while, staring blindly at the wall, Thomas finally whispered, "She absolutely would have really liked you." Evelyn looked softly at his profile, her expression filled with immense grace. "I truly think that I would have really liked her too," she replied with absolute, unwavering sincerity. He nodded his head slowly, finally finding a deep sense of internal peace. He gently placed the folded list back inside the hope chest, completely abandoning the urge to treat the object as something terrifying to actively hide from, but instead fully embracing it as something deeply precious to safely keep, a beautiful, permanent record of a love that had been incredibly real and truly mattered. "I am definitely going to build a massive garden," Thomas said, his voice growing stronger with newfound resolve. "Absolutely not a practical one, just beautiful flowers." He turned his head and looked directly into Evelyn's eyes. "If you will please help me carefully decide exactly which ones we should plant." She looked back at him with the vibrant green eyes that had been paying incredibly close attention to his every move since that Wednesday in September. "Yes," she simply said, speaking completely and entirely with the exact same direct, unwavering honesty she used whenever she said absolutely anything that truly mattered. They were happily married the very next spring, just as the valley was finally thawing from the bitter cold. It was absolutely not a massive, overwhelming wedding celebration because Thomas was fundamentally not a man who enjoyed large, chaotic social gatherings, and Evelyn had firmly decided that the absolute most important part of the entire event was strictly the specific moment where they actually stood together and said the binding words. They officially said their solemn vows inside the small Pine Valley church on a bright sunny Saturday in late April, with absolutely the entire population of the town joyfully present, entirely because the whole community had been deeply and passionately invested in this specific, beautiful outcome for many long months. Sarah Jenkins sat prominently in the very front row of the wooden pews and cried openly, tears streaming down her face with the profound, undeniable satisfaction of a wise woman whose early, hopeful conclusions about their connection had been absolutely correct all along. Thomas spent that entire subsequent summer meticulously building their new house. He absolutely did not build the exact same house he had originally planned out with Amelia. Instead, he built something entirely new, something fundamentally different that was entirely, uniquely theirs. He built a gorgeous, south-facing kitchen, perfectly designed to capture the brilliant morning light, and he constructed a massive, incredibly wide front porch with more than enough room for 2 comfortable rocking chairs and a long, breathtaking view of the valley. And stretching along the entire length of the east side of the beautiful property, he prepared the soil for a massive, sprawling garden, a garden strictly not meant for practical use, containing absolutely no vegetables, just beautiful, vibrant flowers, carefully planted by Evelyn's own hands in May, and fiercely tended to all summer long with the exact same intense, loving care she brought to absolutely everything in her life. Resting securely in the corner of their spacious master bedroom sat the heavy oak hope chest, now completely uncovered and highly visible, remaining a permanent, respected fixture in their daily lives, exactly the way things that were genuinely real and truly mattered absolutely should be kept present. Their beautiful first child happily arrived the very following spring, a healthy, bright-eyed baby girl whom they immediately and lovingly named Amelia Rose. It was a name that Evelyn herself had gently suggested, and one that Thomas had received with the overwhelmed, deeply emotional expression of a broken man who has just been freely given a massive, beautiful gift he honestly does not know exactly how to properly deserve. Their healthy second child came exactly 2 years later, a strong boy they proudly named William, directly honoring the memory of Thomas's late father. The quiet, peaceful years steadily went by in the exact beautiful, comforting way that genuinely good years always do, moving steadily forward, marked by the changing seasons, demanding physical work, and the slow, deeply satisfying accumulation of a wonderful life. Built deliberately and intentionally together, Thomas relentlessly continued to build incredibly sturdy things for the town, and Evelyn continued to flawlessly sew beautiful things for her loyal clients. The sprawling, colorful garden exploded with new growth every single spring, coming back every year vastly more established, vibrant, and beautiful than the year before. On a warm, quiet evening, in their 23rd wonderful year together, Thomas, now 53 years old, and Evelyn, now 42, sat comfortably together on their wide front porch. Amelia Rose had grown into a brilliant young woman and had recently moved away to start her own life in Denver, and William was currently officially apprenticed to a highly skilled master carpenter whom Thomas had personally vouched for. They sat peacefully in the 2 wooden rocking chairs positioned in front of the long, beautiful view, and silently watched the magnificent Colorado evening slowly do exactly what Colorado evenings always beautifully do. Thomas looked fondly down at the massive, sprawling garden, staring at the endless rows of beautiful flowers that possessed absolutely no practical use whatsoever and were simply, unapologetically beautiful. He slowly turned his head and looked deeply at Evelyn sitting right beside him. Her striking auburn hair was gracefully going a brilliant silver at her temples, and her strong, capable hands were gently resting in her lap, hands that had been working relentlessly since, long before he had ever even known her name. She instantly felt his intense gaze upon her and turned her head. "What is it?" she asked softly. "Nothing," he gently replied, a deep, contented smile spreading across his weathered face. "I am just looking." She smiled back, turned her head, and went back to peacefully watching the fading evening light. He went right back to looking at her. He deeply and profoundly thought about a random Wednesday in September, when a brilliant 19-year-old woman with piercing green eyes had suddenly arrived in Pine Valley with 2 heavy trunks and a mechanical sewing machine. He deeply thought about a cowardly carved wooden flower left alone without a note. He thought lovingly about a beautiful young girl of 20 who had loved him entirely, tragically died, and miraculously come back to him in a vivid dream specifically to give him the absolute only permission he had ever desperately needed to finally live again. He deeply thought about exactly what it fundamentally meant to have successfully built something that truly, genuinely lasted. It was absolutely not a massive barn, and it was certainly not a sturdy bridge. "It is exactly this," he said quietly, his voice filled with overwhelming gratitude. "Evelyn," he whispered. She looked back at him, her eyes shining in the twilight. He did not say absolutely anything else to her because he completely understood that he absolutely did not need to. She gently reached out and tightly took his rough hand in hers, and the warm, golden Colorado evening peacefully held them both. I want to take a brief moment to thank each and every one of you for staying with us and listening to this entire beautiful story today. This narrative deeply reminds us that we all undoubtedly carry something heavy from our past that we have deliberately covered up with a thick cloth. We all have our own hidden hope chest sitting quietly in the dark corner of our minds. But the incredible bravery of Thomas Vance shows us that true courage is not found in building an impenetrable wall or running away to a distant city. True courage is finally making the terrifying decision to ride back, to walk through the heavy door with your hat in your trembling hands, and to fiercely declare that you are completely done letting fear dictate your future. Sometimes, when we are incredibly lucky, someone wonderful arrives in our lives who is absolutely worth uncovering that heavy chest for. Someone who helps us plant a beautiful garden simply for the sake of experiencing joy. Always remember to never let fear force you to run away to Denver. Always find the profound courage to ride back. If this story touched your heart, please remember to subscribe to our channel for more deeply moving, meaningful stories just like this one. May God richly bless each and every single one of you who took the time to listen today. Until next time.